Welcome to the final material for our April Art&Chill series. Today we're going to tackle what to me personally is the toughest material ever to paint. So I'm just going to warn you now, this video is probably going to be super long. But today we're going to take a look at rendering water, both as individual droplets as well as entire bodies of water. And because water is such a fluid substance, today I want to change up the structure just completely and look instead at how we can paint water first as just an individual drop, see how it reflects light and how the shadows work. Then we're going to take that and apply it to a massive body of water, such as some waves in an ocean. So whenever you're ready, grab yourselves because this is going to be a long one, and let's just dive right in.
Okay, so the reason I saved water for the very end is because it is the most random of materials, but we are going to start with kind of a sphere, but rather an oval, technically. But I'm just going to block it in with a grey that's slightly darker than the background. Now, water is see-through, right? So the background actually makes a huge difference. But unlike just a regular three-dimensional sphere, even though the light is coming from the top left, the difference is that we're gonna actually paint shadow in there. Now, hear me out. That's because the light doesn't bounce off of the surface of water, right? It goes into the water and refracts so that you actually have an area of lightness on the opposite side, where in like a regular 3D solid sphere, you would see shadow. Here you see light because the light has gone in and refracted all the way around the water droplet, right? And this is why I wanted to save it for the very end, because it's so counterintuitive. But now I'm gonna go ahead and grab a lighter tone, which is slightly lighter than the background. We're not looking to really make everything super pale. I'm mostly concentrating this towards the bottom right, where I feel the light would scatter the most, because that's where the mass of the water is the heaviest, and wherever there's water there's gonna be light scattering around, whereas at the top, because of gravity, you won't have as much mass up there, assuming we are, in a gravity field, where the force is pulling the water down. So at the bottom right is where we would usually see the most mass, and that is where you would see the most light reflecting and refracting. So I'm just gonna go ahead and smooth things out a little bit, just pulling that shadow down a bit further and pulling that light out just a little bit. You still want to have a clear distinction between the highlight, the midtone, and the shadow, but you can kind of work around a tiny bit and it would make a huge difference. And finally, we're going to go ahead and throw in a bit of specular highlight just on top of the darkest areas. Now, this is the light that is bouncing off the surface, but notice how that's just a tiny area, because again, a majority of the light is going to go right through the water, right? So at this stage is where the background comes in, because water will essentially have a bit at the very center that is basically the background but slightly lighter, because you are seeing through it, right? Light goes right through it and then it hits your eye. But also because there's a bit of water in the way, it's going to scatter a little bit. And so that's going to brighten things up. So at the very center, at the area where light is going to shine right through, you're going to see the color of the background, but slightly paler. And obviously the paleness is amplified because the shadow next to it is so dark. So that's something to keep in mind. But I'm just going to go ahead and, lighten that center up just a little bit more. But again, you kind of want to make sure it's not completely blending into that highlight at the bottom, right? So you still want to see some of that separation because, again, water is very fluid and reflective as well as it is refractive. So I'm just going ahead and making that distinction just a little clearer between like the center and the bottom right. And what really sells water is how it casts a shadow. So while water is matter and it is going to cast a shadow, and here you'll see me block in a shadow at the bottom right because shadows still work the same way regardless of what material it is. The issue here is that it's too dense. The shadow is too dense, so we're gonna have to add a spot of brightness in the center of the shadow because, like we've said over and over again, light is going to go right through the water, right? And if it goes right the way through the water, it's going to lighten up that shadow as well, all right? And that is what really sells it as, actual water, because I think personally, this is my opinion of my own painting, but I genuinely think that without the shadow, it just looks like a jelly bean with maybe a plastic coating, but it's the shadow that really sells how transparent the little droplet of water is. So I'm just going in and defining that shadow just a little more. The reason I kept water for the very end is, like I said, it is so counterintuitive. It is so fluid that it doesn't really follow any sense of lighting and form like most of the materials do. And also I wanted to create a process of painting water that would be 100% foolproof. I kind of wanted a standardized process of painting water that gives you good results every single time, because I don't paint water quite as frequently as I paint all the other materials. So every time I painted it, it was mostly just trial and error. So I basically spent a lot of time trying to just paint water over and over and over again, just to get a standard process, which again, with a material that is so flowy and random and just so, you can't contain it, right? You cannot break water down into a step-by-step. It is so intuitive, so that was a bit of a challenge, and that's kind of why I saved this for the very end, because I knew it was going to take me a bit of time to figure out how to break water down into a tutorial that works 100% of the time. So this is the technique I've found. You're going to have your shadow at the point where light is supposed to hit. You're going to have a bit of specular highlight there, and the area where you would normally paint your shadow in a solid sphere is where you actually see your highlight. I've just reduced the size of it for now, just so we can paint like the rest of it, just made it a little smaller. I'm just going in and softening things out. Again, with water, you want to make sure that it is very well blended, but also that you're not painting too much into the shadow like I seem to be doing here for some reason. But yeah, that is the definitive technique to painting a droplet of water. Alright, so let's get on to our very final material study for this month. And what we're gonna do is basically paint an ocean, but I know it sounds overwhelming, but it is essentially just taking what we did with the water droplet and amplifying it, making it bigger and making it cover a bigger space. So I'm just quickly roughing in some sketchy lines just to show you guys kind of a rough idea of the wave patterns that I'm going to be working with. You can completely, have your own wave pattern. You can have no waves at all, but for our purposes today, I am going to be painting like a slightly ripply, wavy ocean kind of thing. So I'm going to start again by blocking in a semi-saturated, semi-dark blue tone, And we are now going to lock the transparency and do what we did with the water droplet. So we're gonna paint shadow where we want the light to hit. Again, remember, it's completely backwards. And just to change things up a little bit, we're gonna pretend the light is coming from the top right of the screen. Okay, so that is the area on every individual wave where we are going to place our shadow, because like I said, the light is gonna go right through and very little is gonna reflect, and we'll get to the specular highlights in just a second. But for now, I'm just using these shadows to kind of define the layers of waves. And that's actually something I almost like to equate to painting hair, where you paint it, instead of looking at it as a whole giant body of water, if you break it down and paint it in little sections, that will make your job a lot easier. So we're gonna pretend there's 3 layers of waves, just as we're painting, not visually, but and then after I'm happy with I'm pretty happy with the shadows at this stage. So I'm gonna grab our highlight tone and place it at the opposite end of each individual wave. So that is at the bottom left, because that is where the light is going to refract in the water, right? That's where we're gonna assume water is heavier or denser. So that's kind of where most of the light is going to essentially just gather with each individual wave. So that's where we're gonna place our highlight tone. Again, I'm not going too crazy saturated quite yet. We'll get to that in a bit. But what we're doing is basically taking that water droplet that we painted and stretching it out. That's what we're doing. So now I've grabbed a soft airbrush and kind of a mid-tone value, slightly more saturated, and I'm just doing that thing where we added a little bit of the background into the mid-tone area, just in between your highlight and shadow. You still want a very distinguishable difference between your shadow tone and your highlight tone, but adding a little bit of mid-tone takes away the edge, because again, water is smooth, right? It's fluid, and fluids don't really have hard edges within themselves, right? So we're gonna try and avoid, she says, as she just painted the hardest edge to ever edge, but I'm gonna stop saying edge. Okay, so I'm just going in and adding a little more kind of layering, and I feel like that really adds that ripple effect to waves. Here's the thing about painting the ocean: it is the ultimate chaos, right? The ocean is the ultimate chaotic element on this planet, because you cannot tell the exact shape and structure of every single little ripple in the water. And as humans, we are not necessarily capable of painting chaos, right? We create in a very structured sense. And even if we were to try and paint chaos, we would have to structure that chaos in our heads, and that just takes away the realism of things. Because remember, the more realistic you want to make something look, the more chaotic you have to make it look, the more random you have to make it look. So now I'm just grabbing a higher saturation, darker blue. That was a little too saturated, but again, I'm basically just undercutting that shadow. But like I was saying, it's the only way to really introduce chaos, and this is where digital painting really shines, is to use a kind of random brush that introduces the randomness for you, rather than having to sit down and really try and structure the randomness, which is an oxymoron, but you know. So at this stage, I felt like I think we're doing pretty okay. Everything was smooth, but not completely like blended or gradients. Like, you still have that layer effect. So I'm going to create a new layer on top, and we're going to start throwing in some of that specular highlights. And I'm going to say specular in quotations because it's technically like debatable whether it's actually specular highlight, but essentially what I'm doing is going ahead and painting over top of that shadow. So this is the light that directly reflects when the light hits the water for the first time on the surface, right? So we're not just going to keep it inside the shadow region, because again, remember, this is an ocean. It kind of has a depth. So when you look at a photo of the ocean, or when you look at the ocean itself, if you actually leave the house, unlike me, you kind of, yes, when you're looking at the world around you, you're essentially turning a 3D scene into 2-dimensionals, right? The ocean has a depth factor because it is huge and it is flowy and it is deep and it expands really far away from you, and that means that light has a lot of entry points over the surface of it, which also means that the light has a lot of reflective points over the surface of the ocean. And that is why you'll sometimes also see some specular highlights in the mid-tone regions as well, and that just helps you further define some of those waves. But at the moment, it's looking very rough because we haven't, introduced that element of randomness quite yet. We're essentially just streaking in some specular highlights that look a little too even. At least for my liking, I felt like it looked way too structured. Like the ocean does not look like this, right? But trust the process, we'll get there. But all I'm doing right now is placing in little waves, little tiny ripples on the surface. And at this stage is where we start to introduce some of that randomness, and we're going to do that by actually using the Smudge Tool. So first I tried to get rid of some of those lines with a soft airbrush eraser, and that already adds like quite a bit of randomness. But what I really want to do is grab that Smudge Tool, and we're gonna smudge out some of those lines. And this is where that randomness comes in, because with a Smudge Tool, especially if you use like custom presets that people share on the internet, I can link you to some in the video description, but you really cannot tell how they're going to function. Like, you really cannot predict every single stroke that the Smudge Tool creates. And while that can be quite frustrating if you're trying to use it on like a structured solid, in this case, that works wonders, because now, as you can see, as I'm going through and smudging pretty much all of those lines, bar maybe one or two on the very surface of the water, what it's doing is introducing that concept of randomness. You cannot tell which colors are gonna go where, basically. You cannot predict how the colors are gonna blend. You cannot predict the end product here. And that is what really gives you that essence of nature, really, because nature is unpredictability. Nature is chaos and conflict and not being able to structure anything or plan for anything, right? And I know it's, we're going into philosophy at this stage, but I feel like art is philosophy, right? Like, when you're painting, you're not painting an object, you're painting an idea, right? Even though you might translate it into objects and into characters wearing certain costumes, you're translating an idea. And I think the idea here is that the ocean listens to nobody and it follows no regimes. It will do whatever the hell it wants to do, and honestly, we could all stand to learn a little bit. But as you can see now, what this has done is, while we've been smudging things out, it has inadvertently created these layers for us because we are smudging in the directions that we painted the waves, right? So what that's done is gone ahead and created those ripples for us, created those layers for us. So at this stage, I created a new layer on top and set it to soft light blending mode. And this is where we're gonna add some of those deeper shadows in. Now, like I said, a lot of the times light will go right through and hit the ocean floor. But because the ocean is so vast and so deep, you won't often be able to see the very floor of it from the very surface, right? So sometimes you'll have areas of deep shadow with no corresponding areas of brightness like next to them because the light has gone down vertically into the earth, right? As opposed to towards you or towards like the bottom left of the canvas, if that makes sense. So that's another bit of randomness, right? So I'm just going in picking different tones of blue, and because we've set it to soft light, it is automatically saturating it just a little bit, but I'm just going ahead and airbrushing a bunch of different tones of blue just to further push that randomness. Now obviously this is not going to be as good as using a smudge tool, but you know, a little bit of structure is okay. So I've gone ahead and merged all of the layers that we've painted so far, and I'm going to create a layer on top. Now here you need it to be a separate layer because we're going to grab a line art brush, and what we're going to do is basically create that specular highlight. So I've picked a bright white color, but don't worry too much about like the actual color because we're eventually going to lock transparency and paint in more ambient tones. But for now, all I'm doing is basically just creating random little strokes here and there, just to lead into these long, thick strokes of specular highlight, basically, that you would see at the very crest of each little wave. But because, like I said, these waves are not in isolation, there is a lot of depth between you and the far end of the ocean. Some of the littler ripples in between these bigger waves are going to catch some of that specular light, right? And so the best way to simulate that is to create little parallel, well, almost parallel little strokes in between the bigger ones. So once I'm happy with that, I know it looks a little crazy right now, but just trust the process. Okay, and I think that's the biggest lesson we can learn from water as a whole, right? Is to trust the process. But anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and lock the transparency, and now we're gonna grab a soft airbrush and start grabbing local colors and painting over the strokes that we made just very gently. So this is gonna make it look like your specular highlights are just a slightly lighter tone of the ambient wave, right? Because we started with white underneath. If you didn't start with white underneath, that's fine. Just pick a slightly lighter, maybe a highlight tone or something. But basically what we're doing is making sure that the kind of specular highlights are visible, but they're not like jarring or just completely out of place. So in areas where I feel like they're a little too visible or they're kind of breaking up the water too much and breaking up the illusion of it being like a continuous fluid, if it's ruining that illusion, I'm just gonna go in and paint over it just with like super high pressure and just paint it back into the water. But that's why we created a new layer for this specifically, so that we can, if we feel like we got rid of too much, we can always bring it back. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, at this rate, I really like this look. It's very sketchy, it's very artistic, but it also looks very watery. Am I even speaking English anymore? I feel like I've lost my words. But it still maintains that illusion of it being fluid without being completely just a soft gradient that has no edges. So you can see that it makes a huge difference to have these little bits of specular highlight, because without it, it's just a little too abstract. So I'm gonna go ahead and unlock the transparency and just add softer little strokes of well, I don't want to say specular highlight, but a highlight tone, just going over the little strokes that we made and connecting some of them depth wise, and that will again really sell that illusion of it being on the surface of the ocean, right? So you have water that you're seeing that is right at the surface, but then when you look through it, you're able to see some of the water underneath. But if we were to only paint the water underneath, that would just end up looking like a piece of fabric, because you wouldn't have that kind of layer by layer effect when you're talking vertically. I don't know if any of this is making sense, but essentially you want to be able to see your deeper, darker, more saturated tones that come from underneath, but you also want to see some of that really bright pops of highlight, of specular light at the very top, and that's what sells the depth of water in a body of water. Wow, I feel like I've rambled on, but I hope that makes a little bit of sense, and I hope when you look at the screen now, you can kind of tell the effect that I'm going for is some of that light just really reflecting off of the very top surface of the water without just completely taking over some of that beautiful depth that we've painted underneath. So I'm just going in and kind of working this back and forth at this stage. I think I quite like how this turned out. I think you don't even want to know how many duds I painted before I actually got to this stage. To be able to standardize it like this, it took a while, but I'm glad I did it, because now I'm able to not just show you, but also have like a standardized step-by-step for myself. So the final step is to grab a soft airbrush and maybe color dodge some of those highlighted areas, and then we're gonna go into soft light and pick a darker tone, and we're gonna bring back some of those shadows that we might have lost. So I'm just gonna go ahead and duplicate our painted layer and add a little bit of a motion blur to it. Now we're gonna create a layer mask, and we're gonna paint all of it black and get rid of that layer being visible at all. And then we're gonna go into white and paint some of that blurriness back in. And I think this again adds that little element of not just randomness, but also motion, because water is never still, right? Well, it's almost never still. Especially if you're seeing waves. So some of that motion blur can actually really help sell that movement and the fluidity of that water. So that's a cool little touch if you're painting water that's in motion, right? Just add a motion blur. That, the trick is it's in the name, right? So I'm just going in and painting it again, trying to make sure not to lose all of our hard edges, but keeping a lot of that motion blur. So you've seen me pause this a million times, and that's probably because I keep getting interrupted. But anyway, so now, okay, so this is the fun part. This is very optional, but I like to add little sparkles just at the very brightest points, the very highest points of the wave. Because that's where the light is the brightest. And I don't know if you've noticed, I'm sure you have, but when you look at the ocean on like a really bright sunny day, it almost looks like diamonds, right? Because there's like splashing bits of water, just little droplets here and there that kind of splash everywhere and reflect light, and it just looks like diamonds. So I like to add actual little starry diamonds in some areas, just because it's fun, it's pretty, I like it. So Finally, we're gonna grab that soft airbrush and set the brush to soft light mode. Grab a darker tone of blue, and again, this is not just gonna darken, it is also going to saturate. So we're just adding some of that deep feeling, that depth. That's what I was trying to say, that depth back in. And that, you guys, is our finished ocean. I really like how it turned out. I really do. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed that.
Whew, that was a long one, but I hope it's been simple to understand, and I hope you've enjoyed rendering water in its many, many forms. I'm really excited to see how your water paintings turned out, because let's face it, it's probably way better than mine. So head on over to the Discord server and find the channel called Tutorial Art Share and share your paintings on there. But with all of that said, thank you so much for painting with me all through this month. I promise next week I will change how I look. And I'll probably also change all of this if you guys don't enjoy it, but I hope you do because this is fun. And I'll see you guys next month with a brand new series here on Art and Chill. Bye guys.